So this week's scripture offerings have several things in common, right? They deal with people on the margins being centered, their needs being fully known. They're both happening at a date, or have to do with a gate. And they're both happenings on the day of rest, the Sabbath, where religious law tells us the requirement is to refrain from working. But what is work, and what constitutes a violation of that law? These are questions that have been negotiated and discussed and contemplated for centuries now, with the input of many, many people. Experts, authorities, economists, scholars, and more have for generations sought to calculate the exact meaning of Sabbath and work. There are layers of gender and power and finance and exploitation all over our historical study of this subject. And so I could never do a complete reexamination of it here today, but we can at least dip our toes into what it means to cultivate functional Sabbath awareness in light of our readings today. To begin with, we have this story in Acts, where Paul sits with women to talk about God on the Sabbath. This story of Paul comes on the heels of Peter's vision and mission in the world we pondered on last week, right? And so when we have a story that begins once again with those trigger words of a leader has a vision, we might be expecting a similar chain of events. But here, Paul is shown a vision of Macedonia and this Macedonian man who is calling him to help change the community. And in following that spirit, he sits with women who become believers because of this testimony, and rather important church leaders for years to come. They choose to share the good news with women, even though they had had a vision of a Macedonian man. In so doing, Paul and his companions cross all over these cultural boundaries to make room for Lydia's openness and hospitality. And while this story is not at its core about Sabbath, it does tell a story of what is allowed on Sabbath. Conversation, conversion, God talk is allowed on rest days. So is this not work? Conversation can sometimes be the action that creates the most healing in a person. And psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, social workers discern in conversation every day of their lives, every day of their work lives. Does the healing of a broken heart constitute work? If we go by economic value, the conversation with and conversion of a wealthy purple cloth dealer in Lydia is of great value to the early church, who might have needed her influence to help them build the movement that will build their movement. So is influencing work? But all right, let's get to the story that does make a point, even just at the end, of questioning Sabbath rule and Sabbath law. The one told in John, which ends on that cliffhanger. It was the Sabbath. You kind of hear the dun-dun at the end of it, right? It sounds ominous to end on, it was the Sabbath. And we in our brains are supposed to remember what that means and why that might be important. This is, on one hand, a healing story, but also it's a story of Jesus' radical hospitality. Jesus heals a person who does not have faith, who knows deep suffering and pain. In his condition, he is waiting for healing, but he knows that he cannot reach the pool by himself. This person who has lived in his own world, his own prison that no one can reach into except Jesus. He's lived in this place surviving and not knowing how to escape. The limitations of his knowledge and healing and access itself obstruct his way towards faith. Very often, it is access to health or healing that holds us back from developing our faith lives. It's a very human thing to see faith building as the non-essential thing, the after all the chores are done and everyone is done for the day and week type of activity. In part, because of our very expectation that church is the only appropriate Sabbath activity. So if church is a day off, a weekend activity, then is faith work? I know many church leaders have heard that before. The call from God can't be work, though as we all know, a lot goes into the creation and execution of everything, including church work. And while the connection of Sabbath and faith learning, teaching, leading, amidst the expectation of Sabbath rest, has cultural, scriptural, and traditional authority, it is also very clearly undercut by so many times that Jesus and the apostles just keep on healing people, no matter what time of day or expectation of the day it should be. Jesus offers compassion to this person, despite his lack of faith, or even knowledge about Jesus. He doesn't know who he is. The story will go on to tell us that when he does take his mat and leave, he's questioned by authorities who say, "How dare you be carrying your mat? Who did this?" And he says, "I don't know. I lost him in the crowd." Jesus sought him out, wants to heal him. This act of Jesus' hospitality, though, knowingly flouts his tradition and violates law. I mentioned in Thursday's Bible study this week that I was struggling with this text this week, not because of the text itself, but because of a devotional I'd come across a week or so in it. In it, the author, Kate DeVoley, takes an alternate view of another gospel Sabbath healings, when the synagogue leader is indignant at Jesus' cure on Sabbath time. They write, "In Jesus' time, the relationship between the Roman Empire and Jewish denizens is fraught. There's a dispensation for Jews to rest on Sabbath, but only because they've successfully argued that it's strictly necessary. People have died showing their faithfulness to the collective bargaining agreement they've negotiated. By healing this woman publicly in a house of Jewish study, Jesus will cross a picket line and risk the empire overturning worker protections for the whole community." That turns it on its head. He heals her anyway. In our story today, he heals him anyway. And that bit right there has had me pondering for 12 days now. I do not ever see Jesus as a union scab who crosses lines and endangers lives, but as one who liberates and allows for greater self-acceptance. And here I am divided. When do we know it is the right thing to heal and to seek healing? How will we know when the right time is to refrain from healing for a greater good? In the cacophony of issues and concurrent social distress, how do we know what concern is most high priority to focus on first? At the core of our faith is a God who is in the permanent business of inviting good for creation. And so everyone, everything, everywhere is of importance to a God so big that she can bolster the sweep of time and universe, and yet intimate enough that they can cry with the individual who weeps in fear and sadness. And while I don't know that we can ever truly conceptualize that span, we do our best by listening for the voice of God that creates a way toward wholeness. And when my wellness comes at the price of another's subjugation, everything becomes much more tricky. Have you ever been told to put your greatest concern aside for the good of the moment? Kate DeVoley asks in the Juniper Formation Daily Dribble devotional. To wait to have your identity or disability or primary concern accommodated until some incremental milestone is reached. This is the crux of human and negotiated movements, but it isn't what God centers on. Can I be a part of this if I am not the first one healed? If it isn't about me? That's a very human concern. Jealousy and justice play into movement for good until we can get ourselves perspective, puts the question of what is work and what is Sabbath back on the table for all the years to come. Is it work to uphold the humanity of a stranger? Is it honoring Sabbath to feed a hungry soul? And scarily I can see how it opens the door to further exploitation. The exploitation of Sabbath not being honored. If Jesus can provide health care on Sunday, why shouldn't others? And if health care workers have to work, then what about food service workers? And what about police? And of course, fire departments, and so on and so on. We end up creating a culture in which there is no work-life balance, and the ability to survive is difficult, if not impossible, to attain. Economic valuation of life is a difficult one. For example, economists estimate that the value of a stay-at-home parent is $205,000 a year. A figure that takes into account the huge variety of work stay-at-home family undertake, and we all know is not paid at all. And as systems of assistance are removed, more and more of our community and neighbors and world partners will talk more and more about how to figure the value of this or that profession, or of caretaking for elder family members and young children, or the community, or the mentally ill. And in all of these conversations, it becomes easy to stop remembering that it's about actual lives that are being affected, and actual people who are injured, left alone, and left behind. Jesus opened the door to undoing the Sabbath laws of his time, but he did it with an awareness of the radicalness of that act. So that in that opening, yes, is the possibility for exploitation. Jesus creates the Sabbath day healings that Paul creates in welcoming conversation with the unknown. There is opportunity. An opportunity to be better than what economic policies based on profit margins tell us is the value of human life, or of any life. To be better than cultural definitions of who the right kind of people are to tell a story, or to hear the story, to spread the message. If these stories are to tell us about the Sabbath work dichotomy, it would have to tell a story of dynamic and contextual health and wholeness, and the unearnable value of caring and love. The attitude of Jesus is God is still working, and so am I, to heal the sick, the powerless, the marginalized, the poor, the wounded, indeed the whole earth. The compassion of Jesus, his radical hospitality, makes people well because it restores relationships. Relationships that we could crush just as fast as they could be built, but relationships that we could learn to honor and build decisively forward towards wellness. The name of the divine took form and shared tragedy and joy alongside us. Jesus sees pain, he offers relief. Paul saw openness to truth and told good news of life affirmation. We are called to do the same, to show up, to take space. We're not meant to silently suffer to free others, because until all are free, no one is free. So in honor of a God who loves like that, we offer love and compassion and try to leave an ear open for the spaces that need our affirmation and our presence. Revelation offers the image of the leaves for healing, for all the nations. Prayed in our peace prayer today for Memorial Day. And so we seek healing too, by being willing to open ourselves to interpretations and truths that seek a way beyond the limits we've placed on creation, beyond the potential for division and battle, into a world that takes care of all